Now we can go. Right. So welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum and to our fascinating talk tonight from Dr. Jonathan Jones. Dr. Jones teaches at the Virginia Military Institute, and he was a postdoctoral scholar in Civil War history at Penn State's George and Ann Richards Civil War Era Center. He received his PhD from Binghamton University, which I'm very proud of myself that I was able to pronounce that correctly. That's the 3 years of living in upstate New York. And this talk that he's going to give us tonight is from his book, which has been advance contracted by UNC Press, University of where is it? North Carolina, Chapel Hill?
Yeah, in Chapel Hill.
Chapel Hill, yeah. Their press. And so the book hopefully will be called Opium Slavery, the Civil War, Veterans, and America's First Opioid Crisis. And his research has basically uncovered that the fact that the Civil War sparked actually an epidemic of drug addiction among the war survivors and these veterans, that it was the first opioid crisis. And it looks at how traumatic experiences of war and PTSD, which of course they did not call it in those days, and the personal toll that addiction took on veterans and their families. He will look at the radical efforts by physicians and the state to try to stem the tide of this addiction crisis, which of course rips through both medicine and society. And so it's a fascinating topic. We know that this is something that is still with us today, and some of our members were with us last year when we had Patrick Radden Keefe talking about the Say Nothing book, and we're hoping he'll come back to talk about his book about the Sackler family. So welcome, and you can host your PowerPoint yourself. Just to reiterate, I know some of you came in after I had given the first little announcement. Those of you who are live with us on Zoom can type your questions down at the bottom into either the Q&A feature or the chat box. We'll monitor both. And if you're with us live on YouTube, I'll be monitoring comments there as well. So do please feel free. Dr. Jones would love to have some conversation or questions with you because his presentation will not take the full time allotted. So over to you, Dr. Jones. Thank you so much, and absolutely welcome to the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I really enjoy talking about this research. Sometimes it's a bit of a gloomy topic, but I appreciate being able to talk about my forthcoming book. So I'm going to start by sharing my slides. And here we have, okay. So let's see, we will, there we go. Okay, so hopefully everyone is able to see the slides. Good. Okay. So I guess I'll start kind of with the current day angle, which is the fact that I think as most of us in the audience are probably aware, that the U.S. is in the midst of a really historic and massive opioid addiction crisis. And so the story in a nutshell is that starting in the late 1990s, millions and millions of Americans have struggled with addiction to opioids. And many of those are to prescription opioids, things like OxyContin and Opana. And the crisis shows no signs of slowing, and actually going on several decades now. It's actually getting worse. Last year, during the midst of the COVID pandemic, there were more than 100,000 overdose deaths in the United States, which is more than any previous year. As a historian, I'm always thinking about sort of the backstory of anything in the news. And so I am oftentimes struck by how the opioid crisis today in 21st century America is oftentimes framed and discussed as if it's something brand new, like something that has never happened before, and the conditions that caused the opioid crisis are not something that could have occurred in the past. And in digging into this issue in the course of writing my book, which is based on a doctoral project that I was working on at Binghamton, is that the reality is that this is not the case. There is a long backstory of opioid addiction in the US, dating all the way back to the 1800s. In fact, the Civil War caused the first true opioid crisis in American history, although that crisis and in general the topic of opioid addiction has been largely kind of shunted to the back burner and overlooked in the ensuing time that has passed. Starting in the 1860s, tens of thousands of Civil War veterans became addicted to opioid medicines, morphine, opium, laudanum, in the wake of the Civil War. And just like Americans today, addicted veterans and their families endured an overwhelming amount of suffering because of their opioid addiction. Addiction ruined veterans' lives, it destroyed their livelihoods, it damaged their reputations, and it even tested and strained significantly veterans' relationships with their families and also with the government. And so what I'm going to do today is to tell the story of Civil War America's opioid crisis. Along the way, I'm going to point out many of these parallels between the past and the present. But I'm going to tell it in kind of a different way than I usually do. I'm going to tell this story as a family story, and the story of an Irish-American family in particular. And their lives, I think, give really good insight into the dramatic but intimate crisis that was the opioid crisis after the Civil War as it unfolded. So here are our two main characters. This is John and Frances Gulrick, John on the left, Frances on the right. This is John here in the center of the left photo. They are a married couple, or they were a married couple in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where they're both from. These are photos of the Gulricks that were taken about 1920. Several decades beyond the Civil War, but at a point in time in which there are still a lot of Civil War veterans and their families floating around in the United States. As you might be able to tell from the images, the Gulricks were socialites. They were actually fixtures on the social scene of Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. from basically the immediate aftermath of the Civil War through their deaths in the 1920s, just a few years after these photos were taken. In so many ways, a shocking number of ways, actually, their lives represent kind of a microcosm of the full Civil War era and not just the opioid addiction crisis. For example, John Gulrick, he was born in 1843. He was a first-generation Irish American. His father immigrated from Sligo, Ireland. And during the Civil War, like many other men in similar situations, teenagers in similar situations, John ultimately ended up enlisting in the Confederate Army. After the Civil War, he went back home to Fredericksburg, helped rebuild the city, and ultimately he became a successful lawyer and then a city judge. So he was a guy that went from the war to achieve a pretty good degree of prominence. Also, as sort of a side hobby, as many Confederate and Union veterans started to do in their old age, as an elderly veteran, John became a notable Civil War speaker. So he would tour the country and give talks, give speeches, and even write books about his experiences during the Civil War. In particular, he became a notable speaker on what historians call the lost cause circuit, which are individuals that presented a certain interpretation of the Civil War that sought to essentially vindicate the Confederacy by covering up the central issues of the war, which were slavery. And so John kind of became famous doing that, giving presentations and speeches on the theme of the lost cause of the Confederacy. His wife, Frances, or Fanny, as she would sign her letters, was also a socialite and a lost cause activist in her own right. She did statue dedications. So these have been in the news over the last few years. Fanny was a member of one of the groups that helped build Civil War monuments. She ran charity events. And so she was sort of an esteemed notable socialite in Virginia in the sense that one might expect of a sort of wealthy person in the Gilded Age of her to achieve. And so the John and Fanny that we see here in these portraits were basically, by all accounts, the highlight of elite Virginia society in the Civil War era. I mean, this was the ideal that most Civil War veterans, most Confederate veterans in particular, would have aspired to. They were wealthy, they were established socially and politically. John was successful in business, Fanny was successful in high society. If you looked up well-adjusted Civil War survivors in the dictionary, I think you would find, that John and Fanny Gulrick meet the definition of that phrase. They, by all accounts, from outward appearances, they had put the Civil War behind them, moved on with their lives, and become successful. Right. The thing is, though, is that in their case, and in the case of so many other Civil War veterans, appearances were often deceiving. They put on like an outward facade of success, but their lived reality was very different internally within their family. So there was more to the Gulricks than meets the eye. Specifically, they had a dark secret that they took extreme measures to conceal from the rest of the world for decades. And that secret was that John Gulrick struggled with morphine addiction. To use the phrasing of the day that Civil War veterans would often discuss or often describe addiction in, John was enslaved to morphine. And ultimately, it came to not just be restrained to the medical sphere, like the health side of his life, but it ultimately came to dominate all facets of his personal life, including his relationship with Fanny Gulrick for decades. In fact, Fanny, to kind of hint at where we're going with this story, Fanny ended up hating John because of his addiction, which nearly tore the couple apart in a dramatic series of events that happened in the summer of 1896. And so all of that is to say that, again, the Gulricks that we see here were living kind of a double life. They have a life of success for the outside world on the one hand, and behind closed doors, a life that's dominated by John's addiction. So how did it come to this? How did this scenario unfold for the Gulricks and for the tens of thousands of other Civil War veterans that were in John's situation? Let's start by kind of setting the stage for John and Fanny's big blow up in the 1890s, about 30 years after the war, by rewinding the clock to the 1860s and showing how the war actually caused cases of addiction like John's. And so we need to start at the beginning, which is Civil War medicine. Like all Virginians of the Civil War generation, the Gulricks' lives were completely shaped by their experience during the Civil War. It upended all facets of life in Virginia between 1861 and 1865. And so as teenagers growing up in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is the seat of two major battles during the Civil War, John and Fanny lived through the thick of the war itself. And they saw some of the worst kind of carnage that came out of the conflict. For example, in December of 1862, there was a very famous battle, famously destructive battle at Fredericksburg, at a hill overlooking the town. It was known as the Battle of Fredericksburg. And when federal troops who were in the process of invading Virginia, they were crossing from the north into Virginia via Fredericksburg. When they descended upon the town in December of 1862, they intended to storm a hill outside Fredericksburg known as Mary's Heights, right? And in the process of doing this, John and Fanny were literally caught in the crossfire on the battlefield. For example, Fanny, when most residents of Fredericksburg heard that the Union Army was coming, they hightailed it out of town. Not Fanny and her family. They ended up hunkering down in their basement and basically waiting out what they hoped would be a short battle. It didn't go that way. The battle was incredibly destructive, as we can see here from the photo, which is one of the most iconic photos of the Civil War, showing the destruction in the city itself from the artillery fire back and forth between the Union and Confederate Army. Fanny, as I mentioned, Fanny and her family were holed up in a house, their home on Charles Street, which is right in the middle of town, downtown Fredericksburg, and it was utterly destroyed by cannon fire and gunfire while Fanny and her parents were hunkered down in the basement. So this was an incredibly traumatic scenario that also illustrates how destructive the conflict could be. For John also witnessed the carnage of the Battle of Fredericksburg, although he was too young at that point to actually enlist in the Confederate Army. However, a few months later, the scene was still fresh in his mind. It was a motivating factor for him to join the Confederate cause. So in May of 1864, at the outset of the war's most destructive phase, which came in the last 2 years, 1864 and 65, John turned 18 and he enlisted in a local artillery unit, which was called the Fredericksburg Artillery. It was a notoriously hard fighting unit. So he couldn't have picked a more grizzled, like veteran outfit to get involved in. And so, for example, the artillery that John joined had already seen action in the Peninsula Campaign in Virginia in 1862, at Second Manassas that same year, then again at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. Then the next year, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the year after that, Wilderness and Spotsylvania. And all of these battles occurred just before John joined. So essentially, this unit is at the thick of the Civil War. It hits all the highlights of the Eastern Theater. And then John shows up to help replace many of the men who had been killed of disease or combat prior to enlisting. So once John signs on to the Fredericksburg Artillery for the duration of the war, he and the rest of the unit are dispatched to the defenses of Robert E. Lee's defenses around the city of Richmond, which is the principal Union war aim, is to go down and occupy Richmond, which is not too far from Fredericksburg. So essentially, John is fighting on his own home turf. At a battle called Cold Harbor, and then at the Siege of Petersburg, which lasted for the last year or so of the war, John and a handful of survivors managed to survive these protracted engagements. They were actually there for Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox. However, the regiment had been decimated. There was only one officer left standing, and about 70 men, including John, who had made it that far through the war. John's morphine troubles began here at the battlefield or the Siege of Petersburg. It all basically began with a bullet wound that he received while serving in the Confederate artillery there defending Richmond. At one point, John was shot in the left thigh while defending a Confederate position at a place called Fort Harrison, which was a key pin in Lee's trenches that were ringing the city of Richmond as a defensive strategy. And so one day in September of 1864, federal troops know that they need to take the fort, so they charge. And as you can guess, all mayhem ensues. And that is when John fell wounded, being basically overrun by thousands and thousands of federal soldiers at this fort that we see here in the image. Now, somehow, although he was shot in the thigh, John manages to survive the mayhem, and his comrades ended up dragging him behind Confederate lines back to a field hospital. And that's where John was introduced to morphine. The field hospital would have looked something like this. This is a kind of a triage facility that develops basically as like a Band-Aid, where Civil War surgeons can decide who is most likely to survive if they're sent back behind the lines to a real hospital, and who is most likely not going to. And so in the process of doing that kind of triage, there were a lot of opioids that flowed very freely in these facilities. Even in the Confederate military, where there were morphine shortages at many of the facilities in Virginia, there were a lot of opioids. And so that's where John would have been first dosed as a pain management strategy for his just terrible gunshot wound. The catch, though, is that John didn't get better. He was triaged as someone who was likely to survive, but he wasn't able to return back to his unit. And so ultimately what ended up happening is that Confederate surgeons patched John up. They sent him on his way with a few doses of morphine back behind the lines at Petersburg to the city of Richmond itself, where he was treated at a hospital called Chimborazo Hospital. And this is a massive 8,000 bed Confederate hospital, the biggest hospital in the country at that point, north and south. And that is also where John would have continued to take morphine at the behest of the surgeons there at Chimborazo. Ultimately, John spent about a month in the hospital, and Confederate surgeons would have given him morphine probably every day, multiple times a day, usually 2 or 3 times a day, to help him get through the night, to help him deal with the pain as he is recovering and fighting off infection. And that's where our story gets really, really interesting. The Civil War was, to kind of put some perspective on it, the Civil War was a massive health crisis. It was actually the biggest outbreak of epidemic diseases and other kinds of sicknesses in US history up to that point. So there were millions of other soldiers in John's exact shoes in the same situation. So the war caused, in addition to millions of cases of diseases like smallpox and dysentery and typhoid fever and other nasty things that luckily we don't have to deal with in 21st century America, the war also caused millions of gunshot wounds and cannonball wounds and other kinds of really traumatic physical wounds like John was dealing with. And so to cope with this massive influx of patients, basically doctors had to double down on what they had learned in med school before the Civil War. And so what they had learned was essentially that when you were dealing with a patient that you couldn't solve their problem, you couldn't cure their disease, you couldn't take their gunshot wound and instantly heal it. The trick was to give them opium while their body did the rest, while their body fought off the infection, while their body healed itself. And so basically what the Civil War meant is that in addition to this influx of diseases, you also saw an influx of prescribing opioids at higher rates than ever before. And also one stat that is always kind of mind-blowing to me, despite the fact that I've kind of been studying and teaching the Civil War for a really long time, is that in Virginia, in John's state where he's from, enlistment rates hit 70% of white males. So basically everyone in Virginia would have either experienced what John Gulrick is going through or known someone, been related to someone who's having this kind of experience. So like I mentioned at kind of the outset of this presentation, John and Fanny, they really are a microcosm of the bigger Civil War experience. Anyways, by the time that the Civil War breaks out in 1861, opioids like those that we see here in the slide, this is a morphine bottle on the right, and this is a typical Civil War era hypodermic needle kit that would have been used to inject opioids into patients like Gulrick. Opioids were by far the most commonly prescribed medications in the US already. When the war broke out, they were already in somewhere between 50 and 80% of all prescriptions that doctors wrote in the 1850s. So these were already really widespread, commonly used medications, and the Civil War caused doctors to up that ante even further. These are actual Civil War prescriptions that were written by surgeons like those who would have treated John Gulrick at Chimborazo. These prescriptions, if you put the screen really close to your face, you might be able to make out that there are red underlines here and the prescription on the right. This is a hospital prescription book from a Confederate hospital where, as you can see, the surgeons are prescribing a lot of different medicines, but in particular, opium. And that's what I've underlined here in red so that you can see the act of prescribing in these sources. Civil War doctors, I mean, they used opium and also other kinds of opioids like morphine and also a 19th century opioid that was called laudanum, which is basically opium powders mixed with ethanol to kind of make up a liquid medicine, which sounds like a doozy, right? They use these medicines for practically everything. For example, dysentery and my favorite Civil War disease, which was called chronic diarrhea. These were some of the most common ailments of the Civil War, and the main remedy was opium. Opium essentially worked as an anti-diarrheal. A side effect of heavy opioid use is constipation. So knowing that, doctors who didn't know what the cause of dysentery was, they didn't know how to cure it, at least they could treat the symptoms, right? And so that's where opium played such an important role in Civil War medicine. I think when most of us think about the Civil War, we think about amputations. And so surgeons also gave out, in particular, hypodermic morphine, but other kinds of opioids as well, to treat amputations. And so here is an example of a Civil War soldier who luckily survived his amputation. Not everyone was so lucky. This individual, just like John, would have also received hypodermic morphine shots to treat his the pain from his incredibly traumatic wound, which we can see in the photo. And that's exactly what happened to John, right? And so the more that I dug into this, this phenomenon of heavy opioid prescribing during the Civil War, the more that I started to wonder questions like, did doctors know whether or not opioids were addictive? If they were kind of giving these medicines out like candy almost, did they know that they might actually be causing a backlash after the war ended if these individuals survived? And I was surprised to learn that, in fact, doctors did know that opioids were addictive, right? And so one of the contributing factors to today's opioid crisis are that not all American physicians realized that drugs like OxyContin were very addictive, right? But the opposite was true in the Civil War era. Most doctors knew that morphine, opium, and laudanum were highly addictive and that you could become dependent on them, but they just didn't have any other options. Like the Civil War was an incredibly overwhelming medical crisis. And so even though they knew that there was the potential to cause cases of addiction, doctors had to double down on these medicines just to simply get through the war. And so these drugs were very important. I think of them almost as important as gunpowder and bullets for the fighting of the Civil War itself. To quote from a Confederate medical Army handbook, which put it like this: opium is the one indispensable drug on the battlefield. It is important to the surgeon as gunpowder is to the ordnance. And so I think that quote really gives us a sense of just how critical these medicines were to keeping armies in the field. Every soldier would have understood that metaphor during the Civil War. So it's no surprise that many Civil War veterans like John ultimately became addicted if they survived the hospital, if they survived their injury or their sickness. Some men actually became addicted in the hospitals during the war years itself, like the facility at Chimborazo where John was treated. But it was actually more common for soldiers to become addicted once they had returned home from the war, once they had been discharged by the army, or once the war ended in 1865. There were no regulations really of any kind on narcotics, on opioids, or most other medical substances in the US until the early 1900s. So when soldiers returned home after having been given pain-relieving morphine in the hospital, they knew that they could simply go down the street to the local general store or maybe ask their local physician and buy morphine to treat themselves. So self-medication was another major contributing factor to the opioid crisis and the lack of regulation to prevent the over-the-counter sale of these narcotics. It's not exactly clear when John became addicted, whether it was in the hospital at Chimborazo or through self-medication after he returned home to Fredericksburg after the end of the war. But considering the nature of his wound, it would have been painful. It would have throbbed every time he planted his foot down or every time he got dressed during the day. And so I'm making an educated guess, basically, that he would have gotten addicted probably in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. But during the wake of the war, it became increasingly clear that whether it was John or whether it was tens of thousands of other Civil War veterans, there was a crisis brewing. It became clear to doctors, to reporters, even to government officials all over the country that in the wake of the war, tens of thousands of Civil War veterans had gotten hooked on these incredibly addictive drugs. And so John wasn't alone in this phenomenon. In fact, the problem eventually got so big over time in the post-Civil War decades that you can find traces of it in all kinds of different sources. You can find examples of it in newspapers. You can find examples of addiction in doctors' records, their handwritten clinical notes. You can find it in public health reports. You can even find it in the records of post-war mental asylums, which we'll return to here momentarily. In some places, the crisis seemed worse than in other places, and that was particularly true of John's hometown, Virginia. During the year 1878, which is about 15 years after the Civil War, the New York Times, obviously one of the country's foremost newspapers even back then, ran an expose story on the drug addiction rates in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, which is where I happen to live. I did not plan that. It just kind of happened that way. But according to the New York Times in 1878, the Shenandoah Valley opioid addiction rates were off the charts. They were like nothing the country had ever seen before. And keep in mind that this is a place that for 4 years between 1861 and 1865, armies moved over back and forth, burning as they went, causing death and destruction. And that was part of the story here, according to the New York Times. In fact, one of the central cities in the region, it was a railroad hub, a place called Stanton, which was home to a mental asylum called the Western State Lunatic Asylum in Virginia. According to the Times, Stanton, quote, has the name of being the great opium city of this part of the country. So it was famously a place where lots of opium was being bought and sold and consumed, particularly by addicted people. So the newspaper sends a reporter to the drugstores in the city of Stanton to figure out where is all this opium going. And it turns out that the reporters were able to determine that the city's drugstores, about a dozen different drugstores in Stanton, were selling about 100 pounds of opium a week. Now that's enough to supply like the whole state of Virginia, right? Not just the local town of Stanton. And some of this might be kind of sounding familiar according to some of the reporting that's come out of today's opioid crisis, which is unfolding in the same region in the same way. Back in 1878, one pharmacist who was interviewed by this New York Times reporter claimed to have sold 79,593 doses of morphine in the previous 12 months. Now, that is a crazy high amount of morphine for a town that only has a few thousand residents, right? And so the Times raised the alarm. Stanton was an example of a particularly hard hit area, but it was the same thing from Chicago to New York City on down to New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Addiction seemed everywhere in the post-Civil War US. Actually, the Times compared it to a literal epidemic. They compared it to cholera or smallpox or yellow fever, other diseases that had broken out during the Civil War. The reporter wrote that when one man sees another man using the terrible drug, before he is aware of it, he too is eating opium himself. The evil of addiction is like an epidemic. It is in the atmosphere. And so this is just one of dozens and dozens of similar reports that are coming out of the United States media during the 1870s and 80s. And this consistent reporting basically forces the state and eventually even the federal government to start realizing that there is a problem and that the problem needs to be dealt with through different kinds of medical solutions. So one of those, we see an advertisement here on the slide, was to actually open up basically state-sponsored drug rehabs, the first drug rehabs in American history, in fact. This facility is what was called the Pinnell Hospital. It is a facility that was opened up by the state of Virginia to, like the ad here, which is a classified ad announcing the opening of this facility. It was opened for the reclamation of inebriates and opium eaters, people like John Gulrick, who were increasingly out and in front of the news during the post-Civil War decade. So this was opened in Richmond in 1876. And like I mentioned, this is really one of America's first drug rehabs. And I think it's particularly important to point out that the state is the driving force behind the opening of this clinic. They feel that the problem has gotten so bad that in an era where there are very few hospitals, they should fund this hospital dedicated to this drug problem. And by no means, I should say that by no means was this opioid addiction epidemic limited to Virginia. It was a national problem. For example, in Boston in 1872, a group of local doctors interviewed pharmacists to figure out why the people of Boston were consuming so much morphine and so much opium. And one pharmacist responded that, quote, veteran soldiers as a class are addicted to opiates. So there's this link that emerges in the wake of the Civil War between Civil War veterans like John Gulrick and this growing national problem of drug addiction. And the situation went on like this for decades. In the war's immediate aftermath, you see a spate of overdoses, but most Civil War veterans actually lived for quite a long time with their opioid addictions. So you see traces of this addiction crisis, not just in the 1860s and 1870s, but even as far forward in time as the 1910s and 20s. For example, there was a Union infantryman that I write about in my book, a guy in many ways similar to John Gulrick, just on the other side of the war. His name was Perry Bowser, and he became addicted to morphine in 1864 at one of the Civil War's pivotal battles, the Battle of Vicksburg. And he was dosed at a military hospital for chronic diarrhea with morphine. And fast forward in time to 1915, his death certificate records him as dying of chronic morphinism, which is a very early 1900s way of saying that he died from the effects of having been addicted to morphine for like 50 years or 2/3 of his life. And I have to admit, I, as a historian, even was surprised by how long people could actually live with their opioid addictions. If you manage to survive overdoses sort of early on in your addiction, if you manage to keep your dose relatively low, you could go on this way for decades and decades and decades, right? And so that long-term kind of ripple effect of the Civil War's health crisis, for me, is one of the big payoffs of this book. It teaches us that the Civil War didn't just it wasn't a flash in the pan. It didn't just occur in the 1860s and then kind of recede into the background as America modernized. It was something that stuck with people. Everyone who survived the war lived with its effects kind of on their bodies for the rest of their lives, right? And so all of that brings us kind of back to our protagonists, John and Fanny Gulrick. The Civil War spawned this epidemic of drug addiction, and this is the backdrop that John and Fanny find themselves in the 1890s. Okay, so I also want to mention, actually, before we return to John and Fanny, just a little bit of some of the side effects of addiction for Civil War veterans, because I think this is an area where we can also see a lot of parallels between past and present. John and Fanny learned the hard way that morphine could take a really heavy toll on your body, and that toll in turn could affect all different other facets of your life and your relationships, right? So addiction was really a twofold problem. It was a medical problem, but also a social problem for people in their lives as well. And that is because addiction back then, just like now, was incredibly stigmatized. It was deeply, deeply stigmatized. It was something that most Americans looked down on. And so it ultimately, if it had been found out that John Gulrick was addicted to morphine, it would have brought shame and sort of dishonor to the Gulricks, these prominent socialites. And so they took extreme lengths to keep it under wraps. And I'll tell you more about that momentarily. But here's what they were trying to cover up. Addicted veterans needed to take opioids daily to function. And so in modern terms, they were, doctors write about people being dependent to opioids. They were physically kind of tethered to the drug. They had to have it at certain spans of time, 2 or 3 times a day. And they couldn't just simply decide to quit taking morphine at will. It was something that they were tied to. That's the root of why Civil War veterans wrote about themselves as being enslaved to opium. It felt like it was their master in a lot of ways. The catch, though, is that this defied expectations for how men were supposed to be like and behave in the Civil War era. So this is part of how the opioid crisis became a social and a cultural crisis as well. During the 19th century, it was thought that by most Americans that men were not supposed to be dependent on anything but themselves. They were supposed to be self-controlled. That was seen as like a hallmark of being the most manly man. And opioid dependency was the opposite of that. It was something, you were supposed to be able to essentially decide that you wanted to quit the morphine and then go out and do so. And when you were not able to do so, it made you seem kind of like you were lesser than, like you were less than manly. Consider also pain relief. And this might be hard for us to kind of wrap our brains around, but the way that the Civil War generation thought about pain was very different than how we think about pain today. It's funny, even something so basic that all humans have felt, which is the feeling of pain, people interpret that feeling differently over time. And so how we think about pain is different than how the Gulricks thought about it. According to Civil War era medicine and culture, not all people were supposed to be able to feel pain deeply enough to actually need painkillers. It was, in fact, only thought that particular people, particularly white women, were supposedly sensitive enough to the sensation of pain to actually need painkillers for long periods of time. Like, according to the medical thinking of the day, you might, if you were going to do an amputation, you might dose the man with chloroform or morphine during the surgery, but he wouldn't need painkillers after that because he was supposed to kind of be able to handle the pain, and it wasn't supposed to be as bad for him as it might have been for someone like Fanny Gulrick. Now, there are all kinds of things wrong with that thinking, but that is kind of the way of thinking about pain in the wake of the Civil War. And so when veterans like John continued to take morphine day after day after day for decades, it not only made them seem dependent, but it also made them seem weak, like they were physically unable to do the thing that men were supposed to be able to do, which was to just kind of grit their teeth and bear it. You might also be surprised to learn, I know I was, that decades of taking morphine can actually cause you to lose a third or half of your body weight. And so it causes very severe emaciation. And this too was also stigmatized during the Civil War. I found some cases of veterans that I write about in my book who lost upwards of 50 to 75 pounds of weight while they were addicted to opioids. So they literally physically appeared skeletal when observers would look at them. And this is part of what freaked people out so much about opioid addiction. Men in this time period were supposed to look sort of like Teddy Roosevelt, like conjure up like an image of Teddy Roosevelt in your mind, these barrel-chested, sort of stocky, robust guys. That was seen as the ideal body type for men in the wake of the Civil War. And that's actually what we see here in this image on the left. I pulled this out of a life insurance manual that was published in 1888. And it literally describes this as being the ideal male body type, the most insurable male body type. But the reality is that after decades and decades of taking morphine, being addicted to morphine, most Civil War veterans who were addicted ended up looking more like the fellow that we see here on the right. They were very emaciated. They had visible indicators that they had been injecting themselves with morphine on their skin. So it was clear to everyone that they, try as they might, they were not necessarily what they appeared to be, if that makes sense. So this was a very unsettling problem, not just in the sense that it could kill you through overdose, but also in the sense that it could kind of unravel all that makes you a man, according to the Civil War generation. I should also point out that opioids the cost of these drugs could add up. A typical month's supply of opioids in the 1870s would cost you $2 to $3 per month. And many people were operating on a budget of $30 a month. So these could be items that for people that are living on the edge, they're living essentially paycheck to paycheck. The cost of needing to take opium every day could really put your family in dire financial straits too. So it just created a really stressful situation that could blow up in families' faces. Now, that's basically what happens to John and Fanny in 1896. So back to John and Fanny. By this point, John is in extremely dire, almost indescribably dire straits. He has been addicted to morphine for perhaps 3 decades. He has lost most of his body weight. He's very unhealthy because of the different effects of morphine. He had also become, according to Fanny, unable to focus. So John, who after the war became a lawyer by trade, he lost his law practice simply because he couldn't finish the cases that he was working on. And so that meant that he lost his ability to bring in income for the Gulricks, and they had a lifestyle to maintain. They had to show the world that they were socialites. And so this really put a damper on their activities and also just their ability to pay their bills. It got quite bad financially for them as well. Not to mention the fact that John is on the verge of death at this point too, because of his addiction. At any moment, he could overdose because his morphine dose is slowly creeping higher and higher every month, every year. Now, considering all that it might cost him, his life, his reputation, his family, their well-being, John over and over and over again promised Fanny that he would quit. He would lay off the morphine and that he would just simply stop taking opioids. And that's kind of what Fanny wanted to hear. And so over the course of the years, he tried multiple times to quit cold turkey or without any kind of medical help. And of course, predictably, that fails. In fact, most veterans did try to quit. Usually it would fail. So this was the typical outcome of a Civil War veteran who wasn't able to get medical help. So the tension between John being very ill, unable to provide for the family, addicted to morphine, and now unable to quit, the tension by the summer of 1896 between the couple had mounted, and it was increasingly clear to Fanny that John was never going to escape from his bondage to morphine. And so one day in the summer of 1896, this situation all came to a head and exploded in a dramatic scene. Fanny returned home to the couple's home in Fredericksburg from an afternoon outing. And when she opened the door to go inside their townhouse, she looks in the doorway and finds that John is slumped over the staircase in a morphine daze, after he had just promised that he would quit morphine yet again. And so Fanny, she snaps, she loses it. After years and years of listening to John's kind of broken promises that he would quit the morphine, Fanny simply couldn't take it anymore. She had had enough and she wanted a divorce. So Fanny runs upstairs to her personal chambers and she pens this very dramatic, emotional letter to her brother describing her plan to abandon John and dissolve their marriage all over this dark secret that they've been keeping from the family for 30 years. And that is that John is secretly enslaved to morphine, unbeknownst to everybody else on the planet except for Fanny, right? And so I'll read you a quote from Fanny's letter. And I should also add that in writing this letter, Fanny's handwriting, which is usually just the most amazing, really clean handwriting, her words got really big and she started kind of scrawling and underlining. So you can tell when she's writing these lines that she's emotional, she's apprehensive, right? And so she explained in this letter to her brother, there is no dependence to be put in John. What can I do? He can do anything if only he could break off this horrible habit, but it seems that he can't, and his mind and his brain are clouded by morphine. Soon, she also added, John will have gotten over the effects of whatever it is that he took, and he will beg me not to do this, but I must, and she underlined those words, for I can neither bear this for myself or for our children any longer. I am obliged to leave him and get a divorce. So Fanny, after penning this letter, popping it in the mail, Fanny immediately leaves the house and flees to Washington, D.C., where they have an apartment, a second residence, and she sets up shop there, swearing that she will never, ever speak to John again. She continued writing a series of letters to multiple different family members, all of which are preserved today at the Virginia Historical Society, describing this dark, terrible kind of secret that the couple has kept. And for their part, when they received this news, the family also freaked out because they had no sign, no indication that John, who appeared to the world to be this like well-adjusted Civil War veteran, was actually suffering from this kind of dark, stigmatized habit. So kind of a fun, not fun, but kind of a dark, but also ironic anecdote. I teach at Virginia Military Institute. And so one of John and Fanny's sons, like many other sons of elite Virginia families at that time, was a cadet at Virginia Military Institute. Again, that's where I teach. And so it's purely coincidental, didn't plan this, but I did end up discovering the letter of that son when he found out for the first time that his father was, addicted to morphine. And he panicked. He told his mother that he was, and this is like a 17-year-old kid. So it's a knee-jerk reaction here, but he tells his mother that he's going to leave the institute and go to Washington, D.C. and become a lawyer and take over his father's practice. And he will provide for her instead of John. So it's none of those things come to fruition. But it's unraveling their family, this news, this event that happens between John and family. Now, keep in mind also that for a woman to go and get a divorce or to even talk about getting a divorce in 1896 Virginia is extremely ill-boding for her family. This is kind of the nuclear option for Fanny. It just wasn't done. And so if that gives you kind of a sense into Fanny's mindset here, she's really has reached her wit's end. Luckily for his sake, for John's sake, his brother also found out the news and he stepped in and he did end up managing to talk Fanny down from the nuclear option. But that raised the question, what will the family do with John? They don't want the rest of the world to find out that John is addicted, but they also need to find some way for him to finally quit the morphine before he dies. So they were between a rock and a hard place. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that Virginia had a series of mental institutions. They were called asylums back then, and that one of those was in Stanton, called the Western Lunatic Asylum. And so one of the options that the family seriously considered was secretly, in the middle of the night, putting John on a train and sending him out to Stanton under a false name to have him committed to the institute, because it was being committed to an institute, an asylum, was also stigmatizing in its own right back then. The problem with this, though, is that it might attract too much attention. What if the press found out that this famous judge was secretly not only addicted, but institutionalized? And so the family decided not to go through with that because of the embarrassment that it might bring. on the family. Or as Fanny's sister-in-law wrote in a letter, it might be talked about in the papers, right? So they have to keep up appearances as best as they can. So instead of divorce or institutionalization, the family came up with a third option, and it's a grim one. What they ultimately did is they decided that they would simply take John to a farmhouse on the outskirts of Fredericksburg, where his brother-in-law is living, lock him in a small windowless room, and take away all of the morphine, and essentially force him to cold turkey withdraw completely unaided. They would give him food, they would give him water, but they would not open the door, they would not let him escape. Ultimately, they ended up, by the way, having to hire guards to watch John because he was, pleading and screaming during this process. And so they found it hard to keep him locked in the room. You can imagine the kind of pain that he was going through. He was lucky to survive this ordeal. After about a year of being locked in this room and forced to detox, they finally let John out, and he returned from his brother's farmhouse to Fredericksburg. But it took a couple more years for Fanny to be willing to take John back before they eventually reunited. Now, the really sad part of this story is about to come, and it's kind of an ironic thing to say because so far this has been a pretty sad story. But all of this, these Herculean efforts that they take to keep John's addiction secret, to keep the rest of the world from finding out about it, and to maybe even help him quit the morphine, it all ultimately came to nothing because John eventually did relapse. Letters, like most Civil War veterans who were addicted to opioids, this is an era before there were really effective ways to treat opioid use disorder. And so most Civil War veterans relapsed once, twice, three times, kind of over and over again. And that's what happened to John. Letters from 1901 and then again from 1910 indicate that John was still using morphine. And eventually word did escape. The rest of the world did find out that John was addicted. Predictably, the family's reputation took a major hit. So for example, Fanny, I mentioned that Fanny was a member of a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And these are the folks who, between the 1890s and about 1920 or so, were active in putting up Confederate monuments kind of all over the country. She was in charge of a local Fredericksburg chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Well, when the members of her organization found out that her husband was addicted to morphine, they forced Fanny to resign. And so she, not only did John have all kinds of problems stemming from his addiction, but she also took a major hit in her social standing as well. And so the moral of the story, and I'll also mention that John eventually dies in 1926, so just a couple of years after that photo that I showed at the outset, and that I'll show here again. And so the moral of the story is basically this, and it's a dark one, that John probably became addicted to opioids as a teenager during the Civil War. He lived the majority of his life addicted, and in the process, it cost him practically everything that he had. It cost him his health, his reputation, his happiness, and eventually almost his marriage. Even if he remained kind of like a local celebrity in Fredericksburg, his reputation was forever tarnished by addiction. And so I think what we can learn about that, about the Gulrick story, about the Civil War era's opioid crisis, and more broadly about Civil War veterans, is that they were not always what they appeared to be. You might see photos of Civil War veterans like these, but in secret, they oftentimes were suffering from all kinds of medical problems and personal problems stemming from the war, in particular, opioid addiction. So that is all that I'll talk about tonight. And at this point, I would love to open it up to questions, and I'm happy to answer anything and everything that you'd like to ask. So I will stop sharing the slides. Perfect.
Great. So I'll monitor YouTube comments too. So anyone that's on YouTube, if you want to type a question in those comments here on the side, I'll just type so you can see. And the same with our guys on Zoom. If you have anything, you can either use the chat feature or that Q&A down here. You just got to hover over the screen at the bottom and Q&A pops up, or chat, so you can type. And I'm not casting aspersions on the speed of your typing, but I'll go ahead and ask a question in the meantime, or make a comment. So that was amazing, Jonathan. Thank you so much for that. And we have a few Civil War buffs on here who'll know a lot more than it about me. And you've fired a lot of questions for me. But one of the things that I think I'd like to ask you is, a perception that I certainly had about the Civil War was that they didn't have a lot of medication, and so they were pouring whiskey down someone's throat as they were sawing off a leg or whatever. And so it's interesting to me to hear that there was actually medicine available, and like the corollary is that the doctors knew, which I'm very shocked at in one way, that it was addictive because they're, particularly as you mentioned, like the laudanum and all these other aspects, they're marketing this like to children and for toothaches and female problems and all kinds. So like they actually do know that this is addictive stuff right from the beginning.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And it's amazing. The more that you dig into the situation that unfolds after the Civil War, the more and more depressing that it gets, right? Because like you, I too was surprised to find out just how much medical care there was for wounded Civil War soldiers, but B, how much doctors knew and they kind of still did it anyways for a variety of reasons. As far as the medical care during the war itself, I think it's funny, the movies and books that we read about the Civil War, they cast such a huge perception over what we think about Civil War medicine. And I too kind of went into this project thinking that it was going to be, all like bone saws, hacking people's arms off, and people kind of slinging down whiskey, and that was Civil War medicine. But what I found was a much more complicated and honestly much more sophisticated version of medicine that I anticipated. During the Civil War, to give you an example, the Union Army distributed microscopes. And so doctors, if they wanted a microscope, they could request it and they could use it to study and discover new things about diseases. So they essentially treated the Civil War, the health crisis of the Civil War, as kind of one big lab experiment. And so in a lot of ways, it was really innovative. But on the other hand, it was such a huge crisis that despite knowing that opioids were addictive and being vaguely aware that a crisis was a possibility, an addiction crisis was a possibility, they still kind of got forced into it, the doctors, right? Opioids, like that, like the one of the quotes that I read, opioids were the one indispensable drug to surgeons during the Civil War.
Well, and as you said, it was masking the symptoms, but it wasn't curing or treating anything,
Absolutely.
So we've had a question, was the Union Army the same? I'm going to go ahead and assume that it was. Sandra is asking that, but you can answer. And then the other question, just to keep you rolling, was, were there big pharmaceutical companies or was it just local pharmacists mixing this up? And where did they get ingredients when supplies were so scarce, or war supplies scarce, I suppose,
Yeah, both fantastic questions. So the situation that I described with the Gulricks was not limited to the Confederate Army or Confederate veterans. It became a national problem. And usually as Civil War historians, when we write a book about the Civil War, we tend to write about either the Union side or the Confederate side. But what I learned in doing this kind of research and in writing the book that I'm writing about this opioid crisis is that it transcended that border between North and South, and also between East and West. It was just an everywhere problem. It got so big that it affected Civil War veterans of all like places and classes and North and South. But one of the interesting things to kind of pivot to the other question is that this situation, this opioid crisis, is unfolding in a world where pharmaceutical companies are, for the first time, growing, like big pharmaceutical companies in the aftermath of the Civil War. It's kind of a funny story. Because the Civil War's medical crisis was so huge, the normal ways that you would buy medicines in the 1800s were not enough. The army couldn't procure enough medicine that way. And so during the Civil War, the government actually founded laboratories they were called back then, for the purpose of creating drugs like opioids, but on an industrial scale. So after the war, when you have veterans kind of dispersing all over the country with addiction problems, all of a sudden you have these industrial scale labs or big like kind of pharmaceutical companies churning out more opioids, more morphine, more opium, more laudanum than ever before. So it's like the perfect storm of a combustible situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I had read, maybe it was for London or something, that housewives like were mixing kind of drops, into water and all this, and so yeah. Um, Now we have Jean on YouTube. She said, "Would you say a little bit more about your research process? Was it primarily archival, and how did you piece this story together?" And that raises an interesting point. I was thinking as you were talking tonight, is this kind of reflected in the pension book? Like, because a lot of Civil War historians use those archives, and so
Yeah.
Are Widow's writing to say he was in bed, for years addicted to laudanum after this or to opium after this. So just a little bit about your research process,
Yeah,
please.
yeah. Thanks for asking. I could talk about the research, like kind of the nerdy side of it forever,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
for days and days. The research involved a lot of detective work because going into this project, I knew that I wanted to learn something about opioid addiction in Civil War veterans. I didn't know when I started the project just how big this crisis was, and I also didn't know if I would be able to find any real like concrete evidence about it. I knew that there were like hints and traces of addiction in some of the sources that I had just kind of seen in my studies, but I didn't know, for example, if somebody like Fanny Gulrick would be willing to write an open letter to her brother saying, "My husband is addicted," even though it's an incredibly stigmatized thing that most people tried to keep secret. And so in the process of doing this study, I did manage to find a couple of source pools where people were willing to bear all and just openly admit, I'm addicted and these are the steps that I've taken to try to confront this problem. One were in the records of what were called at that time soldiers' homes, but today the remnants of these facilities became the modern VA system. And so in old age, a lot of Civil War veterans like John Gulrick became unable to take care of themselves. And it was, again, there were millions of Civil War veterans. Over 3 million men served in the war. So the government wasn't willing or able to, kind of just like turn these guys out to the street. So it created these facilities that they could essentially go and live at. They were kind of like old age homes mixed with hospitals. The catch, though, is that when you wanted to get admitted to one, you had to apply. So you had to fill out an application detailing all of your medical problems and how they stemmed from the Civil War. And so in looking through the records of these hospitals, the first iteration of the VA, I found a lot of veterans who openly admitted that they were addicted because they thought that it would be able to, they thought that that would be grounds for the government to give them medical care. Sometimes it works and sometimes it didn't. Again, it's an incredibly stigmatized condition. So sometimes the people that were running these soldiers' homes said, no, there's no place for you here. But some of them were really sympathetic because they had seen this process at work. And so, when they were confronted with a fellow kind of old soldier, they were open to admitting them into the hospital and giving them medical care. So we can also think about these as being kind of the first drug rehabs on the government's dime, right? Since you mentioned Civil War pensions, I have done a lot of work with Civil War pensions. Sometimes you have Civil War veterans that are describing their addictions in their pension applications. Sometimes Civil War widows, when they would apply for what was called a widow's pension after their veteran spouse died, sometimes they would disclose that info. I've also found a lot of folks covering up their addictions, though, because actually starting in the 1890s, being addicted to morphine was grounds for not getting a pension. If the government found out that you were a Civil War veteran and you were a Union Army veteran specifically, and you were addicted to morphine, that was grounds for having your pension application denied. And so I've literally found pension applications that have like the 19th century equivalent of sticky notes attached to them that say, "This man is an opium eater, denied." So like it involved a lot of detective work, but I got kind of really invested in finding ways around finding ways to find out secret information, basically.
Yeah. And so the archives that, I know, just to kind of go back one step, is the book mostly focused on John's regiment, like that Virginia kind of thing, or is it across the board? You were dealing with medical records from wherever you found them, sort of not one troop or one, my military history is gone, but like not one regiment. Yeah.
Yeah. So I tell in the book, I tell a big national story. I
Yeah.
thought about doing a story just on John and Franny, but I realized that the story that's unfolding isn't just the Gulricks; it's so many other families after
Yeah.
the Civil War as well. So I just tried to draw in as many different angles and sources as I could.
Mm.
So it's focused on the U.S. more broadly, although John and Fanny, their story is so compelling that they're kind of woven into the story of the book
Mm.
at multiple different points.
Yeah, and I think like for me, what was compelling too was, they're not like poor farmers from
Right.
wherever or upstate New York or somewhere in the Carolinas or Tennessee. This is a kind of a wealthy family. We have a couple of more questions. So let me sorry scroll up. Yes, Peter. Hi, Peter. I haven't seen you in ages. Was this a problem starting with the Civil War, or was this a known affliction in earlier wars and society in general? I suppose the opium thing was relatively recent, like because of trade with China, but you can go into that. And how widespread then was this in the civilian population, and what caused it? He said, I'm thinking of Eugene O'Neill's mother in particular. Yeah, that's a good one. Like, how does it? Maybe it starts with veterans and then makes its way out, or starts with housewives and makes its way into the army. I'm not sure, but yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a both great questions. I was curious to know when I started finding more and more cases of Civil War veterans that were hooked on morphine and opium. I wanted to know if they were the first veterans to have this problem. So I went back and looked at the Mexican-American War, at the Revolutionary War, and what I found is that while there were some cases of veterans in those earlier generations wars that became addicted, there weren't nearly as many as there were after the Civil War. So there was something about Civil War medicine that made this a particular problem starting in the 1860s among veterans. Part of it is that the availability of opium-based medicines
Mm-hmm.
skyrockets in the mid-19th century. So in the Revolution, for example, in the 1770s, 1780s, and then into the 1790s, this was before the U.S. had really gotten involved in the China trade, which is how most opium ultimately ended up in the UK or in the United States in the 1800s. And so basically opium was around, but it was too scarce for normal individuals to get their hands on it. And so that precluded a lot of cases of addiction from the revolution. Fast forward to the 1860s, that trade has developed into a multi-million-dollar a year trade. Opium is flowing from all corners of the globe into the United States, and it's everywhere. It's in the local drugstore down the street. You can buy it by mail. You could actually buy it from a Sears catalog. $1.50 would get you a syringe and a bottle of morphine. You would just send your check in the mail and get it sent back to you. And so that surplus of addictive medicines helped contribute to this uniquely combustible situation after the Civil War. The other part of that question was about the difference between veterans and civilians. And I have also found that after the Civil War, there were many, many, many other people who were not veterans, but who were addicted to opioids as well. To give you an example, there's a woman that I write about in my book whose husband was a Confederate soldier in Virginia. So he goes off and essentially disappears for 4 years. And so she is left. She's sort of a poor farmer in a very rural part of Virginia, I think, and she is basically tasked with raising all of their children and keeping the house afloat, and also suddenly running the farm. So this former division of labor, it's now all on her. Meanwhile, she's wondering, is my husband going to die every battle that comes around? She's like searching the newspapers for his name to see if he was killed in action. And so she got incredibly weighed down by the stressors of the Civil War. And to deal with that, she started taking morphine, right? Because morphine has these kind of anti-anxiety effects when, a lot of people in the 19th century took it to help cope with things like stress. And so fast forward to the end of the war, her husband miraculously survives the war. He's one of the lucky ones. He returns home and he finds that his wife is addicted to morphine. He did essentially the same thing that the Gulricks did to John. He kind of locked her in a room and forced her to basically detox. She also survived the process, luckily, but it was a common affliction. And the reason that I bring this up is because the cases of individuals like John, like Civil War veterans in particular, are the ones that got all of the media attention. Those are the ones that you find in the newspapers. Those are the ones that the government was concerned with, even though all other kinds of people had the same problem. They just kind of fell off the radar a little bit because Civil War veterans kind of had a unique place in American society. They were basically famous, right, in their hometowns and on a national scale. And so because of their unique identity, they're the ones that got all the attention, even though other folks had the same problem. And so I think there's a parallel, though, in that to our own opioid crisis. There has been a really long simmering opioid crisis in the United States, of course, going back to the 1990s, but even longer than that, a lot of folks have been addicted to things like heroin. But this hasn't reached the level of a so-called crisis, like an event where the media is putting it on your TV every night. You know, you're hearing about it in the news. It only reached that level sort of in the mid 2000s when certain subsets of Americans started kind of overdosing on drugs, right? You know, people in small town America, mostly like white Americans were the ones who kind of got all the attention for this. And so again, that's a parallel. Civil War veterans, because of their uniquely prominent place, when they got addicted, that's when addiction became a crisis. And that's part of why I label it the book America's First Opioid Crisis. I hope that's a clear answer. It's kind of a long answer, but
No, yeah, I think that's great. And you know, you've just raised two with the similarities with today. You know, heroin we don't really care about, but oh, a prescription drug, you know, that's good. And I was told to take it, and you know, where actually they're kind of the same thing, you know. But yeah, and so
exactly.
they're viewed, you know, differently. And
Absolutely.
you've started to touch on it, but Sandra's asking, was there ever any public discussion of this, like in the newspapers? And you know, I can't remember the name of the book. I read a really interesting book a few years ago about, you know, basically England making China's supply, you know, with paying with the opium and stuff, and
Yeah.
then it talks about drugs. But when Chinese immigrants start coming into the country, and of course they're minimized, or you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1883 or 81. And so that whole how drugs are perceived in this country as being an immigrant problem, as being particularly like the yellow pearl, and how drugs were marketing and opium dens in cities. So it's a very seedy portrayal, like in some of the city things. And yet 20 years earlier, we've got all these Civil War veterans. So, you know, there is certainly a media, I think, presence, but talk to us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this becomes front page news. It starts with in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there was a series of opioid overdose deaths, and that started showing up in newspapers like immediately in 1865, 66. And then there was kind of a lull there for a few years. But again, starting in the mid 1870s, newspapers all over the country, but also medical journals as well, started writing lots of stories about this opioid problem. So the town of Stanton, for example, in Virginia, where the asylum was that they thought about sending John Gulrick to, was like famously in this newspaper article that was published in the New York Times. It was labeled the Great Opium City of Virginia. And so that is to say that there was a lot of press coverage of this phenomenon. And so, there was a lot of attention paid to this. But if you read these articles, the attention that Civil War veterans got for their addictions was a different kind of attention than like Chinese immigrants got. And so what I mean by that is that oftentimes, as much stigma as there was around addiction, you would sometimes find folks who were sympathetic towards Civil War veterans. You know, regardless of their addiction, they could understand, you know, getting addicted to a painkiller if a surgeon gave it to you, right? And so, yes, there's stigma, but also there's some sympathy. But that did not extend to the other folks that are using opium in this time period, particularly Chinese immigrants. And so, for example, at the same time that you have this Civil War opioid crisis unfolding, you also have California, Nevada, they're banning the consumption of opium by Chinese in opium dens, right? So it's this very kind of dual standard. On the one hand, Civil War veterans get some sympathy, everybody else does not. And so again, that's in the wake of, like you mentioned, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is this ban on Chinese immigrants starting in 1882 by the federal government. So the racial context, I think, here is very important to understand.
And it's amazing, like, you know, when you look at a lot of the press in New York City, for instance, like down around 5 points and stuff, which was transitioning out of being an Irish neighborhood into,
Yeah.
a Chinese neighborhood. And a lot of sometimes the Chinese are not actually taking the drugs themselves, but they are running the dens, the opium dens, and there's Irish immigrants going in there at night, and it's very cheap to get a pipe full of opium or whatever it is, and how they're kind of talked about, not being veterans but being construction workers or unemployed or whatever, how they're talked about. Whereas, as you said, like, oh well, it's illegitimate because the doctor prescribed it and he lost his leg and the poor thing, so yeah,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. Hmm.
Yeah, there is one historian puts it like, it kind of explains that phenomenon by saying that there are in the 19th century, and even fast forward to today, there are kind of there are black market drugs, and that would be like heroin or smoking opium, things that get the police's attention, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then there are white market drugs. There are drugs that are prescribed, and so they are okay, or at least if you get addicted to them, it's stigmatized, but you might also merit some sympathy. And so you
Hmm.
definitely see that emerging in the wake of the Civil War, the distinction between those two based on who's using the drug and what the context is, for
Hmm.
sure.
Yeah, well, and it's like, cocaine versus crack.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
you can be on Wall Street doing it and that's fine, but yeah, well, not fine, but you're not going to jail. Yeah.
Right.
Jean is asking too, have you found evidence that black soldiers were using it? Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yes. And it's a question that took me a long time and a lot of research to be able to answer, but I can answer the question finally, after years and years of trying to find an answer. There were very few Black veterans who became addicted to opioids, unlike white veterans, like John Gulrick. So there's this, even among Civil War veterans, there's this racial distinction, and the reason for that is again the racial context of the day. Civil War, the Union Army specifically was comprised of about 10% of Black soldiers who, starting about halfway through the Civil War, were welcomed into the Union Army. However, they got all of the sort of like, they got the worst equipment. They were actually paid less per month than white soldiers. They weren't eligible for promotions beyond a certain threshold, usually. And so, fitting into that pattern, they also tended to get subpar medical care. And so, again, when so much of your medical care basically consists of giving somebody opium, it stands to reason that Black soldiers were less exposed to opioids in Civil War armies. And so what I found is that is the case, and that it translated to a lower rate of addiction among Black Civil War veterans after the war as well. And I think that that kind of pattern is very similar to what we've seen in today's opioid crisis as well. There are all kinds of studies over the last 10 years or so that show that Americans who go to an ER, white Americans are more likely to be prescribed painkillers than Black Americans for a variety of reasons. And so even though 150 years has passed, there's still this pattern that starts to emerge in the wake of the Civil War. It's a really complicated phenomenon, but it translates to this higher rate of addiction among white soldiers and lower rate among Black soldiers.
Yeah, even like the perception that their pain threshold was higher,
Right.
so you're not going to get prescribed. And it's amazing, when you were saying that John in particular, there's this almost like a schedule that you have to have your injection every 2 hours. So like, are they functioning, Jonathan, in between
Mm.
shots, or is he passed out? I suppose it depends on how much you take, right? So
Yeah.
like, you could take a shot and function,
Mhm.
or whatever way they're taking it, and like
Yeah.
go out and make a speech, or does he literally have to pass out for an hour?
Yeah, it's kind of all the above. It
Okay.
depends on the person, and it depends on the dosage. So there are it's a wide spectrum. In my book, I write about like a core group of about 200 subjects or people. And of these guys who I dive really deeply into, their experiences ran the gamut. Like, there are some of them who for decades took really low doses of opium, and they managed to stay that way. So they were fully functional. They ran businesses. Some of them were doctors, so they had successful medical practices. And on the other hand, there were folks who their pain was so great that they started taking opium in really high doses. The more that you take opioids, the more tolerant that your body gets. And so their doses wouldn't stay stable, they would escalate really fast. And so that's when you get to the point of things like overdoses when you're taking too much. One
Mhm.
thing to note, and I think that this may have been what was going on in John's case, is that if you are a person with opioid use disorder and you go for a period of time without having an opioid in your system, your body starts to lose your tolerance. And so when
Mhm.
you consume opium or opioids the next time, it can have a really disastrous effect on your body because your body's not used to it. And so I think that might have been what was going on with John. I think maybe, considering his promises over and over again to quit, I think maybe he had tried to quit and then had a relapse, and that she might have found him at that moment of relapse.
Mhm. Yeah, that is true today. People on methadone and things, and then it
Right.
goes horribly wrong. Yeah. Um, uh, what was it? I just had thought of another thing to ask about. Oh God, it's gone out of my head. So that's Tuesday night. I don't know. It
Yeah.
was something to do with Oh my God. Oh yes, the withdrawal. I was
Oh,
thinking, about films like Train Spotting,
mm,
or Basketball Diaries, like when they have to kind of tie them onto a bed and they're shivering, and it's amazing to have gone cold turkey and
yeah.
survived that, as you said, because they're already, malnourished and already injured or sick, or and
Right.
so to have survived that kind of a desperate, detox is because it really is toxic for the system, I guess, to go
Right.
into temperature fluctuations and stress on your heart.
Yeah. It can
And he was
be.
getting on in age by then, so yeah.
Yeah, yeah, he was not a young fellow. Like, he was a
Yeah.
guy who was already in really frail health. And so he really was very lucky to survive, being locked into a room and
Mhm.
having all the doors and windows closed and kind of just being left there to withdraw on his own. It's a terrible ordeal,
Mhm.
withdrawal. It's very, very grim. I found, unlike John, who lives, I read about several guys who did not survive the process of withdrawal. One of those guys was a Union soldier from Michigan, I think, who his name was Cyrus, and he was for some reason that had nothing to do with his addiction or his Civil War veteran service. He ended up getting arrested at one point, and so in jail, the jailer, he tells the jailer, "I'm addicted to morphine. I usually take morphine," and the jailer predictably refuses to give him the dose and leaves him there to withdraw in the jail cell, and so he died. Now this again, it's covered in the press, right? So this literally in a lot of newspapers became front page news. It was a major scandal because of the fact that by this point, it's like the 1890s. There are a lot of these guys, these Civil War veterans with addictions floating around, and they're starting to gain a degree of sympathy. And so when this guy, when Cyrus, I'm blanking out on his last name, but when it was his like former messmates and old soldiers found out what had happened, they actually went to the state capitol and protested this guy's death as an unjust death. So these deaths were tragic, and they also had a lot of repercussions too when they did happen.
Mhm. And Jonathan, this might be a little bit outside of the scope of your book, but does this kind of go underground for a while then? Like, I'm thinking, by the 20s, a lot of them are dying off, the veterans. We have prohibition, of course, coming in. Like, how come we don't know, sort of, and then I'm thinking about the
Yeah.
Vietnam vets. I just
Uh-huh.
watched, there's a brilliant documentary series on Apple TV called 1971, The Year Music Changed the World. And there's an episode about Vietnam, and they were talking about, I can't even remember what the statistics were, the veterans coming back addicted, and that they
Yeah.
knew, like, that we're going to have a problem in society because these guys are coming back addicted with what they were sort of being officially provided by, over there, or provided with. So yeah, like, so what happens, like, in, we don't really hear about it, do we, with World War I veterans or World War II veterans as much, I'm thinking, and maybe prohibition has something to do with that. And then is it because drugs are pushed underground? And, I don't really know how come this
Yeah.
is not something that continues, until kind of Vietnam and it explodes again. Or
That's a
am I mistaken,
No, no, I think you're definitely onto something here, and that's sort of what ends up happening. Civil War veterans, because there are no good, like in a modern sense, like effective ways to treat addiction back then,
Yeah.
other than just like withdrawal, like cold turkey withdrawal. and a few other methods that doctors start to begin to develop at the early 1900s, there's not a whole lot that they can do for Civil War veterans. So the Civil War's opioid crisis dies off basically when the last Civil War veterans die, right? And so it lasts in the 1920s, and then it kind of goes away. But meanwhile, there are other groups of people that are becoming addicted to drugs. Eventually, the federal government in the 1910s, about a decade before the prohibition of alcohol, the federal government slaps a really restrictive drug law on the books called the Harrison Narcotics Act, and it basically bans the free-flowing opioids that you can just kind of go down to the general store and buy. And so that that has the effect of kind of tamping down on a lot of new cases of addiction. However, there are periodic surges in opioid addiction. So after World War I, for example, people who had known addicted Civil War veterans predicted, here in the 1920s, we're going to have another opioid crisis. And so if you read newspapers from the 1920s, for example, the late 1910s, you find these warnings about the looming World War I opioid crisis. But because of the fact that opioids were much less available, because of these new drug laws, it didn't end up panning out that way. But that's what they were afraid of. Also,
I'd forgotten that you couldn't just go down and buy laudanum in the grocery store,
Yeah. And people found ways around these drug laws. I mean, if you could find a physician to prescribe opioids, it was a lot easier still to get them in 1922 than it is in 2022. But the overall volume of cases tapered down a lot. But then again, fast forward to the Vietnam War, and you do see another panic in the 1970s about American veterans and a new kind of opioids, heroin, right? And so it's almost like we have these recurring cycles of veterans opioid crises. Even in the wake of Iraq and Afghanistan, this has been a major issue facing American veterans today. So it's kind of a cyclical issue in a lot of ways. And I'll also add just really briefly, you mentioned why do we not think about this when we think about opioid crises? Why don't we usually remember that the Civil War caused the first one of these recurring cyclical crises? And it's funny, I found in the congressional debate, the debate that senators and congressmen had about that very first drug law, that they were referencing the Civil War's opioid crisis to each other as a reason to ban drugs, right? And so that I think that's part of the story here, that like the lawmakers who were designing kind of the way that narcotics are regulated in the US today had in the back of their minds the experiences of their parents and their grandparents after the Civil War too. So we might not remember that this happened, but the people that passed the Harrison Act in the 1910s did remember it. So it's just a complicated story.
It is, but it's fascinating, and I mean, we do so much work at the museum, of course, on the Irish American experience, and I remember teaching at Fordham University about the immigrant soldier experience, because the Irish and the Germans enlisted in such huge numbers, and it wasn't something that we ever really looked at much. But I'm thinking now, and it would probably be the same as how the African American soldiers were treated. Possibly immigrant soldiers were not. Were not prescribed these medications as much as maybe citizen soldiers, or because a lot of them flew under the radar, they were poor, they only did their 2 years, they came home. You wonder about how immigrant communities in cities kind of dealt with this, because it must have. And then I'm very interested to know that particularly with the Union Army, it disqualified you from getting a pension. So there's obviously a lot of whitewashing of their own story, as they're looking for their pensions later on. So it's fascinating. Don't think we have any other questions online. I'm just wanting to, not cut anyone out, and I know we've gone a bit over time. So I'll just say on Thursday, guys, we have a curator from the National Gallery in Washington who's going to give a talk. It's basically to help us mark Black History Month. She's going to give a talk about the God, the Shaw, the Gould Shaw Memorial, which was to honor the 54th Regiment from Massachusetts, which of course was one of the first black regiments raised. And the sculptor was St. Gaudens, who was an Irish-born sculptor. So there's always a little connection to the Irish Americans. But Jonathan, we'll have to have you back. The book is not out yet. I know it's been optioned by Chapel Hill there, the press. So we're going to keep an eye on when it's published, and we'll get some copies in the store. Thank you everyone on YouTube and on Zoom for tuning in. This will be available, on our website and stuff to watch, but it was absolutely fascinating, I think. And I'll actually post a link to your website, under the thing, because I know you've published a lot of articles from the book. So if people are interested in finding out or reading a little bit more before the book comes out. But thank you very, very much. And thank you everyone for joining. And if you have anything, Jonathan, to add before we close up, I'd be delighted.
Just a big thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for tuning in.
Yeah, good, really fascinating. And as you say, it's so many parallels with today. It's unusual sometimes for history to be that paralleled. It's a little bit sad, I think, in one way, but we're certainly learning. So thank you very much, and we'll be in touch about the book, everyone, and see some of you back on Thursday, I hope. So take care. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.